Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you, and today I'm here to talk about Anubis Gate, one of my favorite progressive metal bands out there in the scene, and to me, musically on par with pretty much anybody out there. This is a band from Denmark. Of course, Denmark has had their share of really great bands over the years. I can tell you that the Pretty Maids and Artillery are two of my favorites. Anubis Gate is, of course, right up there with them. And musically, this is a phenomenal record. I'm going to start it off by saying it's a 10 out of 10 album. I'm going to not only discuss why I like the album so much. In fact, this is one of two albums they've ever had, Horizons being the other one, where it's a 10 out of 10. The album Covered in Black was a 9 out of 10. Pretty interesting record, actually. I thought that was a... and I'll discuss that here in a little bit. But these last three albums have been an Album of the Year candidate. And I can flat out tell you the other albums before them have not. Not saying there's anything wrong with them, but this is an interesting band. I kind of have Anubis Gate. There's kind of like two eras of the band. So for me, you had if you remember, they put out this thing called the Orbits box set, which included all of their early albums up through the album The Detached. Now, these albums are very good. In fact, Jacob Hansen, another Dane that is really famous for the awesome stuff he does in the studio, making bands sound basically like God. He sang in the band for a little bit as well. And then they had a different singer on the first couple records. But, for me, musically, a lot of the early stuff is a little bit all over the place for me. Most of those albums were 7 out of 10, maybe 8 out of 10 for me, maybe 6 out of 10 for me. But pretty good, solid stuff. But there was never like the album. There was never like an album, like the album. Like every band has the album or a group of records that you think are just absolutely phenomenal. Like for me, like Iron Maiden, for example, Number of the Beast is like the album. Killers. Somewhere in Time, basically like Killers, the first album all the way through, Seventh Son. It's like golden age material. Like, wow, these are albums I can go to at any time. Well, Anubis Gate was never really like that until the Horizons album came out. So they had all these albums all the way through the Detached. And then they had a self-titled album, which was, to me, sounded like it was like more of like a transition. I actually like the sound of it. I actually love the record. When that was kind of like a transition between, the old stuff and then the stuff they are putting out now. I like the last three records by this band. I will put those albums up against almost anything because they are that good. But for me, I think the band really, truly found itself when the self-titled album came out. And ever since then, they went from like being this above average, pretty good band to being like here, to being like a band that I would put up against anybody, from anywhere for that matter. Progressive metal, they play, Anubis Gate is progressive metal at its best. If you've never heard of these guys, I would strongly suggest Interference or Horizons, especially those two albums, to be albums you'd start off with. Of the old stuff, The Detached was probably my favorite. So with that being said, let me talk about Interference and why I like that album so much. So, the thing is this. I think Interference is the most diverse record they've ever done. That, I'll be honest with you, that is the biggest reason I love it. It is the most diverse album they have ever done. Like Covered in Black and Covered in Colors, if you listen to the interview, they talk about how those albums were kind of done at the same time. Covered in Colors is a covers album, so not really going to touch base on that really too much, just because of the fact that covers albums I don't focus on as much. But Covered in Black was an interesting record as well. But when Horizons came out, that was the first album Anubis Gate put out that really just, the light bulb went off in my head, and I'm like, wow, these guys have really done it, because that is a difficult album to really top. As a band, you want to top the other albums you put out after something like that, but that was one of the best records I've ever heard. Covered in Black, I didn't like as much. It was an interesting record because it was a lot different than, in my opinion, the songs were a little bit different, had a little more of a darker tone to it than say the other stuff, and maybe that's why they called it Darker Than Black. But that album I didn't like as much as Horizons, but I thought it was still very, very good, and it was just different, as far as what they had been doing. But prog metal is definitely not, it's not something that, you stick to one element, right? I mean, you just don't. It wouldn't be progressive metal if you did, right? So anyhow, I think Interference is probably the most diverse album that these guys have ever done. And I think that is why I love it as much as I do. Horizons, you could say, is probably up there too, but, I would say Horizons is my favorite album by the band, but I would also say Interference is right up there with it. Like, it'd be like a tie. They'd both be in first place, at least as of now. But I think some of the things that I liked about Interference is this. One, the vocal parts that Henrik wrote, I think are a lot catchier. I think that I think the songwriting is a lot more refined. I think Henrik's singing and the melody lines and stuff that he sings, I think that's a lot more refined. I think it's a lot better than what they've done in the past. As far as the production goes, obviously Jacob Hansen has a hand in some of it. On this album, I believe he mixed the drums, but Kim Alason actually did the mix. I think it sounds great. I think the sound of the album is crystal clear. It sounds good. Everything about it is great. So let's not make a mistake. This is a great album. It's a 10 out of 10. It's album of the year for me. But, if you really like progressive metal, if you've never heard of these guys before, or you have never heard them, I suggest picking up this record. The Interference would be like if someone came to me and said, I've heard of this Anubis Gate band. What albums do you recommend? Interference would be probably one of the first ones I would recommend to them, if not the album I would recommend to them. Horizons would be the other one. Because, ever since that self-titled album came out, I think the music the band is writing now, they're at their peak. I really firmly believe that. And like I said, the band is definitely peaking musically. Interference is definitely not an exception to that. So if you like progressive metal, if you want to hear something really cool, if you like an album that's pretty diverse, pick this album up. Interference. It's out on No Dust Records right now. I know they, at least as of now, have some limited physical copies, but I definitely recommend picking it up, folks. So with that said, thanks for watching. If you like what you see in here, hit the little bell to be notified when I post a video. Subscribe to the channel, give a thumbs up, and leave a comment. Thanks for watching.